thank you for having me. I've had a wonderful day. We had a marvellous day out on the beach, looking for ammonites and fossil wood and finding all sorts of things. So we'll continue with that over the next few days, but in the meantime we've also got some interesting things to look at. As Joseph has mentioned, history is really important. The Bible is the real history of the real world. God is the God of the real world, which is why we go out and do things on beaches, why we have these fossils and artefacts and things, and why we're setting up a museum up in Oswald Street, so that you can go and see the evidence of the real history of the real world. And so we're going to have a look a bit about the history of mankind. Now, we could be here for a very, very long time looking at that. We're just going to look at a couple of aspects of it, and we're particularly going to have a look at how we get all the different variety of people, because that is one thing that the skeptics do scoff at. If the Bible is true, we couldn't possibly get all the variety of people that we have on the earth today. So let's have a look at this. Now, this is the iconic image of where we came from. We ascended from the apes by various mysterious hominids. And when and where did this happen? Well, 3 or so million years ago, an ape decided that it didn't like being an ape. Well, let's not be too fanciful, but somehow apes turned into people via many generations of hominids until you got fully upright, intelligent human beings who developed a sort of wanderlust and decided that they would walk out of Africa, and then they wandered to all sorts of strange places like Britain, and even stranger places like Australia. The Bible tells us a very different origin for people than that. This is a mural that was painted by our artist in Australia named Steve Cardno, who did the artwork for those wonderful children's books up there, and as well as the Star Boy book and the Dinosaur Hunting with John Mackay book there for teens and adults. So do have a look at those. But he's also painted these wonderful murals that we have at Jurassic Ark. And this is the origin of mankind, or a depiction of it, based on Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, where we are told very clearly that mankind was made in the image of God. God spoke and he said, "Let us make man in our image." So the first statement we have about human beings is about their relationship to their Creator. Now that again is a vast and profound topic. We won't go into it too deeply. But God didn't leave it there. The Bible is not just a book of theological theory. There's plenty of that in it. But as we do here, we concentrate on the God of the real world and the God of real history. And God didn't leave it there by just making this theological statement. This is real history, and we are given some more details. So God goes on, God created man in his image. In the image of God, he created them, and then straight away we get a couple of biological details. Male and female, he created them. And then we're told how he made male and female. We have the creation of Adam described simply but straightforwardly and very clearly physically, right? Adam was made out of raw materials. He was not made out of some existing creature. That is very clearly stated, right? Dust of the ground, common elements and molecules of the earth. And if you analyse all living cells, but human cells, you will find these common elements: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, sulfur, phosphorus, sodium, etc. Now, of course, you don't get native carbon in the earth. So a lot of these would be combined into small molecules, carbonates, nitrates, and various other things. Sodium, potassium, chloride, calcium, right? Just common minerals of the earth. So if you put all of that together, yes, you end up with dust of the ground, and you add a little bit of water to that, and you've got good, clean dirt. And boys have never lost their affinity for mud, have they? So we have the creation of Adam, very clearly stated as being from raw materials, not from some existing creatures. We are not related to any animal, and we are not animals that just have bigger brains and more upright stance. Human beings are a very distinctive and separate creation. All right. Then we're told about the creation of Eve, and this is where the jokes usually come in, isn't it? You know, about spare ribs and fig leaves, and this is even when some of the skeptics try and pour scorn on us and say, oh, well, if God took a rib out of Adam, how come men and women have the same number of ribs? There is actually a biological answer to that. I once had one of the tutors when I worked at the university come along to me and say, oh, I had this question that one of the students asked me, and it was that question, but I didn't want to pour scorn on his religion, but I told her to go away and give her an answer in terms of biology, and it's all to do with if you lose a piece of your body, that's not then passed on to the rest of your offspring. Basic high school genetics. And the irony is that woman had a PhD, but she had stopped thinking as soon as someone mentioned the Bible or something that related to religion, as it were. So the creation of Eve, not from raw materials, from tissue that was taken out of Adam. We're just told it was tissue taken from his side. Now, rib is not a bad idea of that. You put your hand on the side of your body and yes, you feel some ribs. However, there is an interesting biological problem here, because how to create female tissue from male tissue? Well, it's all to do with chromosomes. You may have heard of these. They're just bundles of DNA. When a cell is dividing, all of our DNA has to be wound up and tightly packaged in order for the cell to divide. Normally it's all unwound so that the cellular machinery can get access to it and read the DNA code. Now, there is a difference in chromosomes between males and females. So here is a set of male chromosomes. We all have 46, and the first 22 are in pairs, and the last two, we have a mismatched pair there, and one is called X and one is called Y. And this is a chromosome group or a karyotype, it's called, for all males. So every cell in a male body, except for sperm cells, right, will have all of these. And a good shorthand way of describing the set of male chromosomes is to say 46, that's the total number, right, X and Y. If you have a Y chromosome, you are male. Now, what about female chromosomes? This is where the biological problem comes in. Well, female chromosomes are a lot prettier. Actually, here they are using the same staining technique. So again, we have 46, so we have the same number, but we don't have one X and one Y, we have two X's. And so every cell in a female body, right, except for the ova or the egg cells, where you only have half of them, has 46 and two X's. So the difference there is in whether you have two X's and a Y or an X and a Y. It's not to do with any of the other chromosomes. So that's where the biological problem is. So let's go back to the creation of Eve. Again, not from raw materials, from tissue taken from Adam. And how do we solve our biological problem? Well, it's not a problem for the Creator, is it? After all, He made all of those chromosomes, all those 46, so He can manipulate them for however He likes. So if we start with Adam's cells, God will make a whole lot of more cells in order to make Eve. Take out the Y chromosome. Now, He's already created the X chromosome. So Adam and Eve are truly of one flesh. They are the same substance, right? God just has to add another X chromosome. And so we have Adam's cells and Eve's cells. So males need one X chromosome for their life. Actually, you cannot live without an X chromosome. So the X chromosome is not redundant for Adam. He wasn't just given it in order to give one to Eve or have it multiplied to give to Eve. And having two X's in a female is not just to balance the numbers. Females actually need to have two X's for fertility. So we now have two individuals. They are unique creations, but they are of one flesh. And that is important, and we'll look at it in the end. Now, this is where the skeptics will then rise up, even if they accept, all right, we'll let you tell that story, it's a silly story, but we can blow it out of the water by saying, well, how could all of the human races come from just one couple? If we started out with just two people, rather than a nice big group of hominids, how could we get all of the different people that we have? Well, there are many features that define different racial variations, but we'll just look at one of them, and the most obvious and highly publicised one, which of course is skin colour. So, what colour are people? Well, you probably remember that song, Red and Yellow, Black and White. And in fact, there are 4 colours in human skin, but they're not red, yellow, black and white. They're almost there, right? There is red and yellow. But there are 2 shades of brown. One is a very, very dark brown, which is a sort of black brown, and the other is more of a red brown. And the interesting thing is that all people have all these colours. So straight away, if we've got 4 colours to mix with, we've got plenty of scope for a bit of variety. Now let's have a look at how these work, and that gives you an idea of how we can get the variety that we just observe in the world around us. So let's have a look at some human skin. Now this is a piece of skin where it's been cut from top to bottom, and we're looking at the face, the cut edge. So at the top you have the outside world. Then you have what's called a layer of keratin, which is a mixture of proteins. Keratin itself is a protein, but it's also, there are a whole lot of waxes and oils and other things there. Then you have a layer of cells. Now that's called epidermis because it sits on another layer, which is underneath, called dermis, right? And if you've been to a dermatologist, right, that's a skin specialist. So these are all layers of skin. So the epidermis actually makes the keratin. It's just constantly making it, and the dermis is the substance of skin that sort of holds you together. It's full of collagen fibres and elastic fibres and blood vessels. Now here is a diagram of that which might make it a little bit clear. So down the bottom, that sort of pink area is the dermis. Then you've got all of these yellowy orange sorts of cells representing the keratin cells. Now what happens is the bottom layer of those keratin cells, they just sit there and divide and make new keratin cells. And one of those cells, after a cell is divided, will start moving up through those layers. And as it does that, it will make the keratin and accumulate various other substances until it gets to the top. And the cell effectively dies. It's just a little flake of protein and waxes and oils and things like that. And that is what gives you your waterproof surface so that you can go out and face the world, and not so much to stop water from getting in, but rather to stop it from getting out. Cells like to live in a watery environment. Human body is 2/3 water, so if someone calls you a big drip, they're not far from the truth. Cells like to live in a watery environment, so we have to keep that in. So we need a waterproof environment, a waterproof layer, right, so that we can keep the water in our cells and we can also go out in the British rain. So let's go back to our skin layers and relate that to those 4 colours. One colour, of course, we see is red, because in the blood vessels in the dermis, we have red blood cells, and red is the pigment that makes those blood cells red. They genuinely are red, and so that's hemoglobin, and we can see that through the layer of keratin. It's not completely opaque, and you will notice the difference in how red your skin is when you get hot, right? It looks red because blood vessels can open up and send more blood close to the surface. And when you're cold, you go pale. The blood vessels will close up so that you don't have so much blood going to the surface because you lose heat if you do that. Now that means if the layer of keratin is thinner, right, that red will shine through. If any of you have ever tried to paint pictures of people, getting good flesh tones is actually quite an art. And the reason is because there are 4 colours involved. And it's getting the subtle shades and differences in that. It requires good artistic ability. So down in the dermis we have blood vessels where you have blood full of hemoglobin, and so that's where the red is. Now the yellow is a number of substances called carotenoids. Now that's a familiar looking word, right? When you see a word in that, carrots, what colour are they? Sort of yellow or orange. So carotenoids are found in foods. Some of them are quite tasty, and they tend to get concentrated in that outer layer, that keratin layer. And the keratin layer varies in thickness even in one body, and it's thickest in the palms of your hands and the soles of your feet. So I don't suggest that you do this now, but if you have a look at the soles of your feet, sometimes they will have a yellowish sort of tinge if that layer is very, very thick. So if we go back to our skin, so up the top we have keratin, the keratin layer containing carotenoids, and then we'll move to the middle, which is where we get the brown to black colours, right? And that is a substance called melanin. There are 2 variations of this, so that's where we get the black brown and the red brown. But these 2 substances are both made by a particular type of cell that you have in your epidermis called melanocytes. So the melanin is in the epidermis. So all 3 layers of skin contribute to the skin colour that you eventually see when you look at someone. So straight away, can you see how we can get lots and lots of variety by just altering these small things? Now the melanin is what varies most. Really interesting thing is that the number of melanocytes is the same in terms of how many actual melanin producing cells you have per square inch, or however much skin you want to take, is much the same for all racial groups, but yet we have all of this different variety. So what is it that makes it so different? Well, we need to have a closer look at those and how they work. Now this is a piece of skin from someone who has very dark skin, very black skin, and you can see there's a lot of melanin, and notice it sits down in the bottom layer of the epidermis. The melanocytes live down in that layer where the cells are dividing because they have a protective function for dividing cells, so that's where they need to be. And here is a more diagrammatic picture which might make it a bit clearer. That large brown thing that looks like an upside down octopus is a melanocyte. Now they specialise in making melanin, and they then export it to the keratin cells. So they just make up a whole lot of little granules, and then through those long tentacle-like structures they export it to the surrounding melanin cells, and melanin is there to protect the dividing cells from being damaged by radiation that's coming from the outside world. In a very dark person, their melanocytes are very, very active. Now they can be turned up and down, almost like dimmer switches. In a very dark person, they never get completely turned off. They just stay active all the time. The other interesting thing is that not only are they very active, so they make more of these granules, so the keratin cells have got heaps and heaps of these granules. Normally in the process of turning from keratin cell to keratin flakes or keratin layer there, the melanin granules get broken down with the rest of the cell inclusions. But in a very dark person, that doesn't happen. The melanin granules just stay there right up until the top. In a very light person, well, for a start, you don't have as many melanin granules to start with because the cells aren't active. And in a very light person, the melanin cells are never fully turned on. So we don't have as many to start with, and then as the keratin cells move up through that process of making the keratin, what melanosomes, that's the name of the little granules, they get broken down, and so you end up with very, very light skin. So getting that sort of variation is not a problem. The variation occurs because of we have two types of melanin. We have the black-brown and the red-brown, and the melanin cells do vary in what ratio they make eumelanin. The red-brown one is called pheomelanin. How active they are, whether they are active all the time, only some of the time, or hardly any of the time, and how much the melanin persists in that keratin layer during that process of going from the bottom to the top. So if we combine all of those colours and all that activity, it's not a problem to see how we can get all of that variety, because all people have all those colours, and the different colours are from variations of the same colour combination. But how did we get the distinctive colour combinations? Because the usual story is that they evolved, and they evolved for the sun, because as we said, melanin, its function is to protect skin from incoming ultraviolet light or incoming radiation from the sun. So the standard story is something like this. Melanin protects the skin from damage by ultraviolet light from the sun, so dark skin evolved in high ultraviolet regions. Skin does need some sunlight to make vitamin D. So light skin evolved in low ultraviolet regions where there's not much sunlight, but we still need to make vitamin D. So the differences should relate to how much ultraviolet there is in the environment where people evolved. Now, if this is true, the colour skin pattern should match, or the distribution of coloured skin should match the amount of ultraviolet light or the pattern of ultraviolet light that there is on the Earth. So if we look at a map of the Earth, ultraviolet light comes from the sun. It will penetrate straight through the atmosphere, and it will get the best run through the atmosphere, as it were, if it gets a straight run. So the tropical regions either side of the equator will get the most. Up in the polar regions, it has further to go through the atmosphere before it hits the ground. So the top and the bottom of the world are darker in terms of ultraviolet light. There's less ultraviolet light. Now, it's not quite as simple as that, because the Earth is not completely smooth and flat. It has high areas and low areas, and the very high areas like the Deccan Plateau or the Andes Mountains, right, are closer to where the ultraviolet light is coming in, so they will have a higher amount of ultraviolet light for people living on the ground there. And also the amount of water in the atmosphere varies a bit, so the Sahara Desert, middle of Australia, very high ultraviolet light regions. Now, does that pattern fit the pattern we find of skin colours? Now, these days, people are wandering all over the world and they're mixing and matching. What we need to know is, what about the people who supposedly evolved in these different locations before we all decided to go wandering all around the world? Well, in those pre-travelling days, there is some data, and we do have it from going back to the early part of the 20th century. Researchers did go and look at what are called the native peoples of different parts of the world, and they came up with this map of human skin colour different distribution. Now, does it work in terms of ultraviolet light? Maybe. All right, yes, for sub-Saharan Africa compared with Europe, it's not bad, is it? After all, the equator goes through the middle of Africa there. So you've got a region where you have a lot of people with very dark skin living in the tropics. Up in Europe, Britain, Scandinavia, you've got a whole lot of light-coloured people because they're far away from the equator, and the ultraviolet light levels are pretty low. Well, can we do a sort of reality check there? Let's look at the rest of the world. Does it work for the Americas? In fact, the people who live in the northernmost parts of the Americas, so Canada, Alaska, right, the Inuit, or what used to be called the Eskimos, they're actually a middle brown sort of colour. You can go all the way down through the Americas, look at the Native Americans into South America, and then go all the way down to the bottom to Tierra del Fuego. And again, you've got middle brown people. Now, a bit of variation, but you don't get that very, very deep black people in South America there like you do in sub-Saharan Africa. And the Inuit people who live high in Canada, right, are not as white as the Scandinavians. So it doesn't quite work there either. Now, look at Australia. It doesn't work there either. Now, this is for the Aboriginal Australians. Right? And in fact, they are all dark. Australia is a big place. I've had a few conversations with people describing how big Australia is. So the top part is near the equator. The bottom part is as far away from the equator as a fair bit of Mediterranean Europe. So let's go back and do a sort of reality check. This was a particular study that was done a few years ago, and we reported it in our evidence news or in our newsletter, so you can go and look for it. We archive all of the things that we send out in our newsletter onto a website called the Fact File, and you can just look those up, do a keyword search. You don't need to know when it was sent out, but this was a particular study that was looking at skin colour genes in European populations. Now, you don't need to know the name of this gene, but they found a mutation of this particular gene resulted in lighter skin. And they found higher rates. They looked at it in Spain, and higher rates were found in regions with lower ultraviolet light. And they decided that this was actually a good mutation. Now, there are reasons for not believing that, which you can, if you read the original article that we've got on our website, you can see that. But let's consider that. Let's consider how far away is Spain from the equator and how far away are the southern parts of Australia away. All right, you have light colour in Europe, in Spain, and you have dark colour of the Australian Aborigines down at the southern part of Australia, and particularly in Tasmania. All right. Both of those are 40 degrees of latitude away from the equator. So we have light colour and dark colour. So we cannot explain it simply in terms of how far away you are from the equator and how much ultraviolet light there is. And in fact, this is a picture of the natives or Aborigines of Tasmania. This was painted in the mid-1800s, and they were as dark as the Aborigines who live up on the York Peninsula, right up near the equator. So let's have a look at how we can get those distinctive colour combinations using biblical history. Now, we need to remember biblical biology is different from evolutionary biology. Remember the picture of the ape turning into people, right? Everything's going up, according to the evolutionists. The Bible clearly tells us that things are going down. Everything started out very good. So when we look at the world with this sort of biblical mindset, we look at the world, we will see brilliant design, amazing things. And I never ever tire of finding examples of brilliant design which we write about in our newsletter. Sadly, the world did not stay very good. It came under the influence of sin and judgment, and so things are going downhill. What we're seeing in the world today is the results of degeneration, and Mutations and natural selection are part of that. Now, these are things that are considered to be driving forces of evolution. They do produce change, but it's not upward change, it's degenerative change. The world has certainly changed, but it hasn't evolved. So change is real, mutations are real, natural selection is real, but evolution is not. Those changes are degenerative changes, and the evidence fits that. So let's go back and look at our biblical biology. So we go back and start in the in the Garden of Eden with our two people, and notice we've depicted them as being a sort of mid-brown colour. And if you think about it, most of the world's population is that sort of mid-brown colour. Very pale and very dark are actually a minority. And now we're getting all sorts of mixing and matching as well. Would that be very good skin? Well, if God says when he had finished making Adam and Eve, he then pronounced the world as being very good, it must be. Now, why would it be very good? Well, there was some ultraviolet light getting through there, so we did need melanin. Adam and Eve would have needed melanin to protect their rapidly dividing cells in their skin, but we need that ultraviolet light to make vitamin D. So their skin was not black and it wasn't white. And melanin cells, as we said, vary in their activity even within people, and they do respond to changing levels, even quite subtle changes in level in ultraviolet. So that would have been the very good skin colour, not black, not white. So in the beginning, there were no mutations, right? Everything was very good. But all people are a mixture of the same colours, as we said. If we're all descended from Adam and Eve, the original colour could probably be described as a sort of rosy brown colour, and those extreme variations wouldn't have been present at the beginning. Now, people might think that's a rather sort of racist statement, but we will explain it. So let's go and look at what's the history of the human race. We started out as one couple, Adam and Eve. Now through 10 generations, we end up with Noah and his wife, who then had 3 sons. So we have Japheth, Shem and Ham and their wives. Now there's an interesting aspect to those names. Ham has the connotations of being dark. It really means sort of burnt or hot. So if things are burnt or hot, they go dark. Japheth has the connotations of being fair or light. Shem is unrelated to colour. So we're starting to see that degeneration happening just in the subtle control genes. Now, to make melanin, you need a whole lot of genes just to make the stuff itself. And then you have a whole lot of genes that control the variation in the melanin cells, as we've said. So by Noah's time, we do have some loss of the control genes, and we probably have a bit more variation than we would have had in the original very good world. So by the time of Noah and his sons, we're starting to get a sort of spectrum of skin colour. Now, if we keep going through the generations, we know that after the flood, the 3 sons of Noah gave rise to the people who assembled at around the Tower of Babel. So we keep going with our biblical history. By Noah's time, right, we're starting to lose control of some of the skin colour genes. By the time of Babel, we've got further loss, and so we have more extremes of colours. So by the time of the Tower of Babel, and we know that degeneration of the environment really took off after Noah's flood in lots of aspects. So that's probably when we started to get this very, very big spectrum that we've got. Now, a lot of people will object as to why we call skin colour expansion. In other words, why this big spectrum is degeneration. Well, some of us have experienced it from personal experience. I can testify to that myself. Having very light skin, which I will blame on my British ancestors. I used to think all grandmothers came from England because mine did. This is the sort of advice that gets meted out to white Australians every summer. Light skin is not good in strong sunlight, so you have to take precautions. And this little ditty at the bottom, slip, slop, slap, that they got carried away with the S's. The last one, which is a pair of sunglasses, slide, means slide on sunglasses. And you get posters like this one here. This is put out by a cancer charity. And one of the ways they raise money actually is to sell sunscreen. I'm one of their regular customers. And the other thing, if you can't find a tree to be underneath, you can have an umbrella like that, which has a sun protection factor of 50 plus, but it's equally good at keeping out British rain. Now, the other end of the spectrum has its problems as well. If you are a very dark person whose ancestors are in sub-Saharan Africa and you move to Northern Europe or Northern America, you have a hard time keeping up your vitamin D levels. And in some places in Canada and the northern states in North America, they actually put vitamin D in the milk. And I notice these days you can buy vitamin D tablets, and people are recommended to buy them if they live in places where there's not a lot of ultraviolet light. So the two ends of the spectrum do have their problems, so they can't be said to be very good. That doesn't mean there's anything morally wrong with them or anything like that. We are all on that downward path going downhill. If our skin doesn't get it, something else will. So the extreme variations would not have been present at the beginning, but they are a physical reminder that we're all going downhill and we're not evolving upwards. So let's summarise that. Noah's time, a little bit of loss of control genes after Babel. Interesting thing happened at Babel, didn't it? We have limited gene pools with further loss of the control genes, and the differences would have been reinforced by the separation. So let's have a look at that. This is another mural made by our artist Steve Cardno. By the time you get to the Tower of Babel, yes, you've got quite a lot of variation in the skin colours and also other aspects of human bodies. So you would have ended up with a very large gene pool, but mixing would have been possible because all of the people were together. Remember, they all came together to rebel against God, but God outsmarted the lot of them and said, all right, you are so smart, I will sort you out and separate you, because that's what he had told the descendants of Noah to do, to spread out over the earth and fill it. So he made sure that they did by dividing them up according to language groups. Now, he would not have divided nuclear families. The subgroups that he divided into were probably clan groups. And if you read the Table of Nations, which is Genesis 10, it actually tells you where the descendants of Noah's 3 sons and grandsons went out to. So after Babel, that big variation of skin colour, that big gene pool, would have been split up. Now you think about each of those small groups going out from the Tower of Babel, speaking a different language. They would have all interbred with one another for many generations. So whatever genes that they took out of the gene pool would have been reinforced so that many generations down the track you end up with distinctive features that are different to the people who lived over in the next valley or on the next island over there somewhere, because they've been interbreeding, they've been inbreeding within themselves and reinforcing a different group of genes that they took from the original gene pool. So our history of human races, it's not a problem. We can go from Adam and Eve to all the people who spread out abroad after the flood quite easily without any problems from biology. So after the Tower of Babel, people spread out in all different directions. So that means that human beings went into Africa. They didn't come out of it. And one of our colleagues, John Osgood, has actually done a lot of interesting historical research. Joseph, do we have any of John Osgood's books? We do, good. Yes, he's done a lot of historical research. He's also a medical doctor, so he's done some interesting genetic research as well and put these things together. And so these are a couple of maps that I actually drew them up for him because he needed to publish them, but he did the research, so I can't take any of the credit for that. And the interesting thing is the genetic revolution that we're now experiencing, right? You can actually look for groups of different genes. Now, obviously, we can't go back and look at Japheth's genes or even his grandsons or their grandsons, but we do see migration patterns through the different parts of the world. This is one of the maps that John Osgood drew up, just based on looking at the changes that we have in stuff called mitochondrial DNA. You might have heard of that. It's a bit different to the nuclear DNA which makes up the chromosomes. It's out in the cells, but you have a lot of it because you have many mitochondria in all of the cells, so it's easy to test for. So we do have an idea of where we've got these migrations from, looking at biblical history, and all of our genetic research confirms that, it doesn't deny it. So the descendants of Japheth, right, the one who tended to have fair skin, they tended to go to Europe. You can read that, or what is now Europe. You read Javan and Tarshish, names that you read in the Bible, not just as names of people, but also of places. Now, what about the people who ended up down at the bottom end of Australia? How did they get there? Well, again, not a problem. Modern genetics is actually proving what the Bible tells us. And it's interesting that you can trace a migration path from the Middle East to Australia via India. And there are some interesting recent studies looking at the genetics of Australian Aboriginals and the genetics of some people groups in India, and there are distinct links there. So don't be afraid of modern genetic science. It's building the evidence for the Bible from the history that we know. Now, how did they get to Australia? Because you can see there are quite a lot of islands there. Well, there was a time after the flood where you have the post-flood continents in place, but the sea levels would have gone up and down, particularly during the Ice Age, and there was an Ice Age, by huge amounts. And so, you know, we're told to be fearing if the sea levels go up and down by a few millimetres. They went up and down, they've been up and down by metres, and the evidence is there. Now, when the sea levels were low, of course, that means there would have been land bridges, areas that are now under the sea, but not that far under the sea, that would have been exposed. And they would have been land bridges for both animals and people, because remember, the animals also had to migrate all over the earth to refill the earth. So it's not a problem getting to Australia. If you look at those lighter blue areas, that's where the sea levels are exposed if the sea levels went down. Those are the sort of continental shelf areas where the seas are much shallower. So if the sea levels were lower, they would have been exposed. Some of the Australian Aboriginals will tell you that they walked there. Some did come by sea, but some of them will tell you they walked there over the land. Now, why does this matter? Adam and Eve, Noah and sons and Babel, why it does matter. In spite of what William Lane Craig was just telling us, it does matter. We have all of these details because this is real history. It's not theological theory. It cannot be reconciled with evolution. Now, William Lane Craig should take notice of Richard Dawkins, because sometimes Richard Dawkins says something that's right. Amazing. And this is something he wrote in his book about evolution. Richard Dawkins wrote, "All too many preachers, while agreeing that evolution is true and Adam and Eve never existed, will then blithely go into the pulpit and make some moral or theological point about Adam and Eve in their sermons, without once mentioning that, of course, Adam and Eve never actually existed. If challenged, they will protest that they intended a purely symbolic meaning, perhaps something to do with original sin or the virtues of innocence." And this is Richard Dawkins' challenge. How is the person in the pew or on the prayer mat? Remember, Richard Dawkins despises all religions, not just Christianity, and he particularly despises Islam. We've written a couple of items about that. You'll find those on our fact file as well. How is the person on the pew or the prayer mat supposed to know which bits of scripture to take literally and which bits symbolically? And I think that is a good challenge to William Lane Craig, who we heard earlier. However, we need to go back to the scriptures. Richard Dawkins might be right on this issue, but he's wrong on most others. So let's go to someone who's always right. Jesus is more right. I'm not sure whether that's good English, but anyway. When Jesus was challenged on a moral issue, he went back to the beginning and said, "Have you not read, he who created them in the beginning made them male and female, and therefore a man shall leave his mother and father, and the two shall become one flesh." It's not just moral and social issues. Jesus based these on the reality of Adam and Eve. I've also had that personally challenged to me. I worked with a whole lot of feminists who despised the Christian teaching on marriage and family. And their ultimate excuse is, well, the story of Adam and Eve is just a myth, so it has no authority. Only reality has authority. It's also a matter for the gospel. Now, we are often challenged at creation research that, stay away from this. It's not a gospel issue. Why are you bothering with it? It does matter a lot. And so let's look at one example of a man who was challenged on this very issue. How was Paul, who was addressing a whole lot of pagans, a whole lot of people who were different race from him? He was a Jew, he was addressing Greeks. Right. And here was his answer. He had to take the Greeks back to the beginning because he had to explain to the Greeks why a Jew who was crucified by the Romans is their Lord and Saviour. And in order to do that, he says, God made out of every nation of mankind from one man, right? Having determined allotted periods and boundaries of their dwelling place, that they should seek God in the hope that they might feel their way and find him. So what he is telling is that you Greeks are not different from us Jews or from any of the other people that Paul has preached to, because we all came from one man. And it was the creator of that one man who determined that we would be in the places that we are. And Paul goes on, now he commands all people everywhere to repent, because he has fixed a day on which he will judge the world in righteousness by a man whom he has appointed. Right? Who's that? It's Jesus, and has given assurance of all of this by raising him from the dead. So the Apostle Paul goes from creation to the resurrection to the end of the world, because this is the real history of the real world. So instead of having an ascent of mankind from ape to humans, sadly, it is a descent. We did start out from Adam and Eve, and the entire human race can be subsumed into Adam. Because remember, Eve was made out of tissue taken from Adam. So we go from Adam through an unbroken line to Jesus, Jesus, the Son of God, as described in Mark 1. Adam is also called the Son of God. Interesting. Adam and Jesus. Very good, very strong connection there, an unbroken line from Adam to Jesus. So ultimately, hang on, we're going backwards, aren't we? Let's go forwards. Christ is every nation's creator, as the Apostle Paul said. God determined where you were. Christ is also every nation's judge and saviour. This is our basis for mission, right? So Paul sticks very firmly to the one-man principle. We started out, the human race, or mankind started out as one man. So just as sin came into the world through one man and death through sin, so death spread to all man because we've all sinned. He then goes on, for as by one man's disobedience the many were made sinners, so by one man's obedience the many will be made righteous. And this is summed up beautifully in another one of Paul's letters, of course, as in Adam all die, so in Christ also in Christ shall all be made alive. So yes, it's gone from good to bad, but there is good news at the end of it. So it's good to bad to worse, but there is salvation and glory at the end of it. Let's leave it there. I've been rather verbose, I think. Do we have any time for questions? Just a reminder, if you do want to follow up any of these individual examples, you can look up our fact file and our Ask site. And also, that's our question and answer site. We've started collating some of those questions, and this book here, Your Questions Answered, has a whole section on Adam and Eve, and also a whole section on dealing with theistic evolution. How do we deal with people like William Lane Craig? And the answer is we can. We don't need to be intimidated just because he has PhD after his name and can talk a whole lot of theological theory. So do have a look at that.
Yeah, we do have some time for questions. A couple of quick resources as well that Diane hasn't mentioned or briefly mentioned earlier. We do have some of those things from John Osgood, as well as on the Q&A site. We have articles by him, so that's well worth a look. We've got, these are more sort of archaeological rather than steam color and history of man, but they're still very fascinating. The times of Abraham and the Philistines, and Egypt, Israel, and the Exodus. There's actually 5 in this series, and I'm hoping to print the rest of them here in the UK shortly.
Yes.
Also, if you don't just want, if you want to have a resource that's not just standing up and talking and giving a lecture, I can hear the speaker starting to go. You want to check out, we've got The Real Roots of Man and the Origin of the Races. Fascinating evidence that the human groups all come from an historical event at Babel and from the one man that God created. Actually filmed around the world, featuring John Mackay. This isn't just a standing up lecture. This is actually travel out and see the evidence and speak to the local people and speak to the natives and the different ethnic groups themselves and see where the evidence actually leads. So you'll find those DVDs over on the table there. I think we do have time for a few questions. So has anybody got any questions for Diane about the topic in general or the presentation tonight?
Oh, up there, yes.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I haven't had a lot of time to think about this question, but is it possible for female humans to live with just one X chromosome?
Yes, it is actually. You can live with. The question was: is it possible to live with just one X chromosome without a matching pair? Yes, that is. That is a well-known genetic problem, and it is a problem because those women are not fertile. You need 2 X's to be fertile. But you can't have Y and no X. You just need an X chromosome to live. It has a lot of essential genes on it for general life, not just for femaleness. Yes, another question up the back there.
I'm curious, it says in the days of Peleg, the land divided, and this is absolutely brilliant, that's what you've done today, I love it. Would that have been anything to do with Australian bit as well? Or where did that come from?
Oh, where it says in the days of Peleg, the world was divided. I think that does refer to the world of people as much as landforms and things like that, because and it's quite possible that is the time of the Babel event, because it's several generations after Noah's sons. And obviously something significant happened there, that the world was divided. So it probably means the world of people, in the same way as we talked about the world versus the godly people in the New Testament.
So from a geological perspective, it's very unlikely that the days of Peleg refer to the splitting of the continents. Just a small earthquake in sort of terms of global size can wreak enormous amounts of havoc.
Like that one in Tonga.
Exactly. So to split apart entire continents in that speed over short, maybe a few years around Peleg, it would destroy pretty much all life on Earth. So you don't have to attribute the splitting of the continents to the days of Peleg. You can attribute it to the other time when all life was destroyed on Earth, which was the global flood. It makes much more sense that it's actually the global flood which is breaking up the continental plates and pushing them apart into what we see today, rather than later in the days of Peleg. So yeah, we probably go with that being a biological.
Yes, where it talks about the world of people. Yes.
Any other final question?
So that's sort of like talking about days of Peleg not being a continental divide. That would sort of break God's covenant, that there wouldn't be another global flood or cataclysm that would destroy the earth.
Yeah, I mean, everything that we see geologically would say that a continental split of that scale would destroy all life on Earth. It would certainly be something that would be, it would be a lot more evident in terms of seeing evidence of people experiencing that, even if people were able to survive. So yeah, God promised never to destroy the world by flood, because He is going to destroy the world again. So yeah. Although this time it's going to be global warming, isn't it?
Yes, global warming on a scale that the skeptics could never contend with. Yes, indeed. Yes.
Thank you very much, Diane.
Thank you.